what do you remember about walking into this project, however many years ago that was, and having me try to convince you to do it?
Hi everyone, thank you, Anne. I remember, well, like you said, we had just recently worked together on Oasis in the City, which was a great experience. And I was already quite immersed in MOMA history at the time. And what I remember is that it was a very easy sell. I mean, it was, you didn't have to do much to convince me. I loved the idea behind this book, everything that you just articulated about opening up the history of the museum, making it more complex, bringing all these figures sort of out of the shadows and into the forefront, and recognizing all of the things that they did. So it was, yeah, it was a pretty, it was an easy decision for me.
So let's get more specific, and I'm going to ask you the same thing, Sloane. How did you work at getting to know Elodie Corder, who's the subject of Romy's essay, and probably the least famous person? The two people we decided to invite to talk to you tonight are the people who wrote about the two least famous people in the whole book. And so they both had what were actually the hardest jobs.
So, like you said, when I first started on the project, I delved pretty deeply into the archives and spent a lot of time with all of the women that we were planning to feature in the book. One of the things, and most of that time was spent at MoMA's amazing archives, which are incredible in their depth and just a wonderful resource. But another thing that I did in the process when I first got started is I went to the Archives of American Art, which are part of the Smithsonian, and I listened to all of these interviews that were done by a man named Russell Lines, who is the person who wrote the most recent history of the Museum of Modern Art, but that was written in 1973. So those interviews were done in the late 60s and early 70s. And he spoke with all different types of people in order to inform his book, which is called The Good Old Modern. And one of the people he spoke with was Elodie Corder. And I have to say, I fell for her very easily right away. She was so charming, and she told all these fantastic stories.
You should tell people what she did.
Oh yes, of course. Because she's one of the least well known, of course. She was the director of the Circulating Exhibitions Department, which started pretty early on in the museum's history. So MoMA opened in 1929, and by 1933 the department had started. She was working on it even before it was really—
That's her, by the way.
That's her, exactly. Even before it was technically a department. And what they did is they organized exhibitions that traveled across the country. And they were all different types of exhibitions. Sometimes they were based on an artist. Sometimes they were based on an art movement. Sometimes they were all original works of art. Sometimes they were actually all reproductions of works of art, which is one thing that really is different from back then to today. Sometimes they were actually a combination of the two. There'd be one original painting and a series of reproductions around it. And they traveled all over the country to places big and small, sometimes conventional places like other museums, art galleries, universities. But one of my favorite things actually that I came to learn about Elodie Corder is that she was very, she had a strong belief that that art should be accessible to, to Americans, to the most people that it could get to. And so she sent her exhibitions to libraries, to department stores, to movie theaters, to women's clubs, all kinds of places, unconventional places across the country. And she did that for almost a decade. And so when I was listening to these conversations with her and Russell Lines, she was telling all these fabulous stories about her early days at the museum and the kind of pratfalls that she got into, not knowing what she was doing, and I fell for her right away. So, remind me of the initial question.
For
Sarah.
well, for Elodie, actually, Romy chose Elodie. You didn't really get to choose Sarah Newmeyer.
No.
But what was it like getting to know her?
Okay. Well, I miss her still. I think first of all, thank you guys both for having me. This is really exciting, especially because, like you said, unlike a lot of the other women, I felt this incredible responsibility because Sarah was, for lack of a better term, from scratch. I had no other sort of, we had original documentation, thanks to Romy, who just shortly before the pandemic dropped off a metric ton of research that I remember sort of looking at you and being like, did you take the elevator or just the steps? Because this is tremendous. It was like a cartoon of someone being, having research foisted upon them, but incredibly well organized and tabbed. And I thought, okay, well, this woman was the MoMA's publicist. I think I can get this. Before I became a full-time writer, I was a publicist at Random House. I know a little bit about institutions that have a mix of a need to sort of soldier forth into new territory they're not particularly interested in going to, and old personalities that are great. So I'm like, I got this. And I think I didn't expect personal overlap, but I didn't expect Sarah to have so much personality in her job, which must have been pretty difficult. But so Sarah, just to speak a little bit about her, I think she was born in Ohio, I might be messing that up, but then she moved to California. She was the eldest of 5 kids, which is, if you know anything about how people behave with birth orders, she would have either been the youngest or the eldest, because she's just very bossy and a lot of personality. And she wrote plays. She had a play that was very successful in Berkeley. She had a play on Broadway in New York. And the one sort of missing link is how the heck the museum found her. I'm gonna go with a party we don't know about. I just, it's sort of a strange missing link, but then she sort of became the museum's first mouthpiece. And what's funny is she rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because, like you said, this is a time period, and it still persists, in which people think to pick up the phone and call on behalf of something is a form of essentially like legalized prostitution. It's okay, you can call someone and say, come see this exhibit. But she did it out of such pure love for the museum and such defensiveness over it, and she, so I think getting to know someone through their memos, but not a biography, getting to know them through these letters that they sent and the tone. I've done other projects where I did short biographical pieces that are about very well-known people. I did a piece about Josephine Baker's life in France, but I think everyone here knows who Josephine Baker is. I've never done this sort of get to know you from scratch, and it was a really beautiful experience.
Can everybody hear us through our mic? Are we all holding our mics okay?
Okay, yeah.
Excellent, okay.
Good. Should have asked that, sorry.
No, I thought we were fine,
Okay.
good. So, Romy was talking about listening to the tape of Elodie Corder, and I wonder if you can go into that a little more, because reading your essay, your whole clue to your take on her went through careful listening. or emerged from careful listening. So tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things about this conversation, this interview, was, you begin to realize that we all know, I think, being New Yorkers, that New York is a very small world, and sometimes it seems even more so back then. And so one of the things that came out very early as I was listening in this interview was actually the process of how Elodie Corder ended up leaving the museum. And it really struck me. And one of the things that struck me about it was the emotion in Elodie's voice as she was discussing this. So after after 10 to 15 years on the job, she had gotten married, she became pregnant, she took a kind of, what they had that was sort of like maternity leave at the time. She'd taken about a year off as a leave of absence from her position.
Unpaid.
Unpaid, of course. And she was sort of thinking about what was next for her. She was the director of this department. She had a ton of responsibility. She was an evangelist for what she did. She believed in it wholeheartedly. And she believed in the idea of teaching Americans about modern art. And yet she was at a crossroads. She wasn't quite sure what to do. And so she brought her young son to the pediatrician, and it turns out that her pediatrician was Dr. Spock, child rearing fame. So she went to her pediatrician with her 1-year-old, not just to talk about, how he was doing and all the typical things at a 1-year appointment, but also to talk with him about sort of what she should do at this crossroads in her life in terms of, should she go back to work, should she spend more time at home because she was able to with her young son. And she approached him with this question, and his response was so dismissive that I could hear it in her voice. Even 30 years later, her voice still cracked at the discussion of this conversation that she had with Dr. Spock. And it was so meaningful, and it was so moving that it really took me in. And it seemed like, and I think we all in some way sort of found aspects of these women that we really related to. And I think these moments and the ways in which, everyone, but especially women, sort of face the challenge of balancing family and work, and those questions, they're still very relevant today, unfortunately so. And then I started looking into some of the documents that related to her work life, and I felt that there was kind of a parallel to some extent in that misunderstanding of her work, not just from this authority figure that she had gone to for kind of comfort and guidance, but also within the museum herself, and within the museum itself, that didn't quite value her to the extent that she should have been valued, and didn't quite understand the work that she was doing, and felt that the exhibitions that she was doing and providing for the rest of the United States should be bringing in money into the museum, and the fact that they weren't kind of self-supporting or even bringing in money to the museum was a problem, and then maybe they weren't even, that worthwhile in the first place.
And tensions that resonate 100 years later with how much are we a missionary institution, a educational institution, and how much are we you know, an entertainment center looking for maximized income and audiences, right? But Sloane, you also have a kind of dramatic exit story for Sarah.
Doubly dramatic. Yeah.
Spoiler alert here for Sloane's
Yeah,
essay.
well, the first is dramatic in terms of office politics, and then the second is dramatic in terms of, it's an understatement to say it's a dramatic exit. So the first is, you know, what happened was because she was sort of the first of her kind in many ways, especially for a museum and especially surrounded by a lot of these other women and where they came from. I mean, I think a lot of these other women came from a place of extreme privilege. Sarah did not, you know, they did have families. Sarah really didn't, of her own. I mean, she's obviously had a family, but, and she was really outspoken. I mean, there are things that you know today that are due to Sarah. Obviously, you would have been vaguely familiar with Van Gogh, were it not for her. But the concept of the sort of reproductions on mouse pads and umbrellas and the, you know, making a line around the block for a museum exhibition was really what Sarah did. She made it a big deal. There's a great story that I learned at some point through your research, differential, in which Einstein had come to an opening of an exhibit and was so sort of entranced by it.
Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein. Bob Einstein. And I think everyone here knows what I'm talking about. No, but Albert Einstein. But it was so entranced by it that he was staying past closing hours, and she just sort of like ran around and like told the security guards not to say anything while she phoned the press. To say that he stayed past, do you know what I mean? And so she was a bloodhound, essentially. And that kind of personality, while actually pretty typical today, was not so typical then, and especially in a culture like the museums. And so what happened was she started to sort of garner attention that she shouldn't have gotten for herself, as opposed to being the transitive property for the art and the exhibitions, like Whistler's Mother, all these things that she really sort of banged the drum for. And there was a huge piece on her in the Saturday Evening Post called The Museum and the Redhead. She had red hair. And she wore a lot of like green suits with red hair. I mean, you can't really tell because these photos are black and white, but all these women just, not to be too superficial, but they look amazing. But she was getting too much attention for herself, for this unusual sort of position that she occupied, and the museum didn't like that. So I believe it was in 48, when was she? She was ushered out. And the press release that I came upon announcing her sort of departure was very depressing. After reading this huge sort of, you know, like a diner menu, like this biblical tome about Sarah and her life, it was just one page that said something like, she'll be going to pursue other endeavors, and I think because she had been known for, she wrote a book about art, she had written all these plays, she'll be going to pursue other endeavors, and she'll be speaking at Kent State. And the way I put it in the essay is like, well, people go to Ohio and come back. You don't leave because you have a speaking gig at Kent State. You return. And so there's something else going on here. So I think she was just sort of drawing too much attention. So that is the first, that's chapter 1 of the exit. And then the other sharp exit is sort of shocking. She, after living on like Jane Street in the West Village and working here, she moved to Old Sturbridge Village, which is, some people are laughing, which is essentially like a colonial Williamsburg but smaller and in Connecticut, and there's butter that's being churned. Yeah. So this is sort of a shocking move for Sarah. And then there was a hurricane that came through the area and flooded her basement. And she and a handyman went down to check on the damage. I don't know how to say this because it's not funny, but it's horrible. Sarah was essentially electrocuted. I know. And then she died. She was, I think, in a lot of pain. And she died a few days later in the hospital from her injuries. So it's like, I know I'm getting the chills just thinking about it. So it's just a very cruel and sudden end to an almost forgotten woman, but on the bright side, this is actually part of the reason I'm so delighted to write what I wrote and to be asked to write about it, because it was like, you guys made it so I felt like the Lorax speaking for the trees, you know? So thank you.
Yeah, that's so great.